there. If you're staying home for care group this year because of the COVID, we are wanting to provide for you just a brief outline of what each chapter in 2 Samuel is for the sake of care groups. You can find the commentary and the questions online under ministries on our website, Faith Bible Church, faithbibleoc.org. And on that ministries page, just click on that, go down to care groups, click on that, and you'll find the questions and the commentary, the completed commentary written out for you. And what you can do is grab the commentary, grab the questions, read through the commentary, answer the questions, and help you understand each of the chapters of the text. And so this video is really just to give you a quick overview of what the commentary contains. I want to encourage you not to just watch this video, but to take time and make sure that that you read the commentary and see everything that's there. There's so much in the text that's super important. Now, I didn't record a video for the first care group week, which was just an introduction to the text. What I want to do now is just communicate the first chapter. So we're just going to walk through the first chapter of 2 Samuel and explain what is going on here. Now, the first thing that happens when you read 2 Samuel is you have the story of an Amalekite who walks probably a 3 days journey from where Saul is fighting the Philistines to where David has just finished killing all the Amalekite invaders that had raided Ziklag. And he gathers back his wives, takes the spoils from the raiders and brings them all back, and is now enjoying and dividing the spoils of that war. And this Amalekite shows up with the news that Saul has died. Now, initially, it seems like an incredibly harsh response of David. He kills this young man, and it seems very strange that he would do so, because this guy's just bringing news to him of the death of Saul. But when you compare the story that the Amalekite tells with the story that the narrator tells us at the end of 1 Samuel, what you find out is that the Amalekite was lying. Now, David doesn't know that the Amalekite's lying. He doesn't have access to the 1 Samuel text at this point. He just understands that the Amalekite is sinning in what has happened. If he really had killed Saul, that it would be sinning. And so David kills the Amalekite according to the Mosaic law. Now, what happens here? Well, we need to understand all this. First thing you have to remember is that 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel are one scroll. They were initially designed or written as one scroll, but because it was too big, they cut it in half. And where they cut it in half is right between the death of Saul and the story of this Amalekite. And so we have this death of Saul and the story of the Amalekite that touch each other, but they're cut in the books. And if you just read 2 Samuel without reading the end of 1 Samuel, you think David's just a super harsh guy. The reality is the Amalekite has come with the crown and the wristband of Saul, and he comes to David and he says, "I've killed Saul. Saul is your enemy. I've killed him." Now, the truth is, we know Saul killed himself. He fell on his own sword. The Amalekite didn't do anything. So how did he get his crown and his wristband? Well, probably he was on the battlefield and he sees the dead king and he picks him up and he thinks to himself, well, I can take these to David. I can curry favor with David. David will probably make me a general or something because I've killed Saul. I've won this war for him, and now David is free. He's able to become the king. So this Amalekite is essentially trying to tell a lie and use what he essentially finds as spoils on the battlefield as a way to curry favor with David, who he expects to be the new king. Now, the fact that he comes and he tells David that he's done this isn't in itself necessarily the issue that David's going to kill him for. David kills this man, and if you can see it so clearly down in verse 16, David said to him, "Your blood is on your head, for your mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." Now, at first glance, you might think, how would this Amalekite have known that Saul was the king? But what you find out earlier in the verses, in verse 13, is that the Amalekite was not a first-generation Amalekite living among the Jews. He was actually a second-generation Amalekite. In verse 13, it says, David said to the young man who told him, "Where are you from?" And he answered, "I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite." So David actually understands now that this man, his parents were aliens who were living in Israel. In other words, they had essentially proselytized. They had become members of the Jewish society at that point. Now, whether they were Jewish or not, we're not sure. But his bloodline is an Amalekite, but he has now been living among the children of Israel as a second-generation person. He's the son of an alien. What that means is that this man knew the political intrigues, he knew the law of Moses, and he knew the expectations on him in terms of righteousness. He should not have killed the king. He could have done all sorts of different things at that moment, right? When Saul sees him and says, please kill me, let's say that this story really true, which it wasn't, but let's say that it was. If Saul says, hey, please kill me, the Amalekite could have said, no, I won't do that, but I'll defend you. I'll protect you from the Philistines, even if I give up my own life. But I'm not going to stretch out my hand and kill the king. That's what he ought to have said. Instead, he tells David that he does kill him according to Saul's orders, and he expects David to be pleased with him. And so David punishes him according to the law of Moses. Instead of protecting the king in a moment of the king's distress, he actually kills the king. Even if it were truly by Saul's own request, it wouldn't matter. He should have protected him and defended him instead. So he's killed for that reason. Now, what happens at the end of the chapter here is interesting. There's this dirge, a funeral song that's sung for Saul and Jonathan. Now, obviously, Jonathan was David's very close friend. We know that from 1 Samuel chapter 18. But Saul was really David's enemy. And so why does David sing a funeral song exalting Saul and Jonathan? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but the main reason that he does this is because David is a man of righteousness. And so this song is recorded for us, not so much to show that Saul was a great guy, because we already know that Saul wasn't a great guy based on the narrative from 1 Samuel. But this song shows that David is a righteous man. How does he show his righteousness? Well, he does it by honoring Saul in his death. Even though Saul was his enemy, Saul was still God's anointed. He was still the king. And so David, in respect to God and in respect to the man that is now in the position of king because of God's will, sings a song, a funeral song for him, and teaches the sons of Judah, even teaches the people of the tribe that he knows will be enemies with the house of Saul later on. He teaches them to sing this song honoring Saul. Ultimately, the goal is to honor God. And what that actually reveals is that David is a man after God's own heart. He wants to honor God, and to do that, he does it by honoring the man that God has put in place as the king. And so that's the whole point of this psalm. That's written here. And what's interesting is that this song essentially becomes the way that kings are mourned later on in the historical texts. And so David sort of writes the funeral song for future kings. It's fascinating. Now, one other point here that's really interesting is verse 26. Very interesting verse, a little sketchy when you first read it. It says, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You've been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was more wonderful than the love of women. Now, initially when we read this, you might think, whoa, that sounds like maybe David struggled with some, same-sex attraction. But that's not at all what this text is saying. It's very important. There are at least three reasons why we know that's not the case. Number one, Jonathan we already know that word love, your love for me was more wonderful than love of women, is actually the same word that's used by Jonathan by the narrator in 1 Samuel 18 about Jonathan's affection, his heart affection toward David. It has nothing to do with physicality. It has nothing to do with a physical relationship whatsoever. It's just the affection of Jonathan's heart toward David. And what David uses the exact same Hebrew word here to describe the affection of his heart and the affection of Jonathan's heart toward him. What he's saying is they're very, very, very close friends. It's an issue of affection. That's important. As Americans, I think sometimes we connect the idea of love and physical intimacy. We put those two things together, but that's really not at all in the mind of David. He's not thinking that whatsoever. He's just talking about the loyalty, the affectionate loyalty that Jonathan had towards him. And he says it's better than even the affections of a woman for me. And that brings us to our second point. So number one is that it's affection. It has nothing to do with physicality. Number two, David had multiple wives. We find out at the beginning of chapter 3 that David has at least 6 wives in Hebron. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that David is a guy who's got lots of wives, but very few friends, right? And so Jonathan's close friendship to him is an important component in terms of his affection for Jonathan. They have this close affection for one another. In ancient Near East, wives are really there for procreation more than companionship. And so David, in an unrighteous way, has many wives for procreation, but his affections are really with his buddies, his friends. And so that's the second point, is that really this shows that his affections for Jonathan are very strong, and it's really revelatory of his relationship with his many wives. Well, the third point that tells us that this is not the case is that according to the law of Moses, homosexuals had to die by stoning. They were supposed to be killed. For David to write this and to intend to say that he and Jonathan had some kind of physical relationship would essentially be signing his death warrant. David would never have said that. Had they had a relationship like that, he would never have communicated that, and especially would never have written it down, and especially would never have communicated in a song that was intended to be an everlasting song that was essentially a funeral song for coming kings. He wouldn't have said those things. And so the point, those 3 points show us that that's not at all what David means. Now, obviously, modern readers read that, and there's a temptation to read it that way. But we want to take ourselves out of the modern notion and think about what the author intends to communicate. The author's intention here is not to say that they had a relationship. Obviously, the author's intention is to show that they were close friends. In fact, the closest of friends, in such a way, as it says in 1 Samuel 18, they loved one another as they loved themselves. They had a close kinship between them. That's the communication that's being made there. And so that summarizes chapter 1. I hope that's helpful for you. And we'll pick up with chapter 2 on the next video. Thanks.